I look after Glenmorangie and Ardbeg. Basically, what Michael and I do is we make the whisky and we make lots of terrible faux pas in our press interviews, and Hamish's job is then to run round and clear up the mess behind us. And I think he does a reasonable job. Hamish gave a little bit of an introduction to the very, very checkered history of Ardbeg Distillery. And I can very, very vividly remember my first ever introduction to Ardbeg. I was Glenmorangie Distillery manager at the time, and I used to get very, very frequent nuisance visits from a writer who some of you will know called Jim Murray. He used to come and stalk me at the distillery, and every time Jim came in, he used to extol the virtues of Ardbeg. And to be fair to Jim, I used to just pay him lip service. As an ex-Diageo man, I knew Lagavulin and Kalila very well, and I used to say to Jim, yeah, I'm sure Ardbeg's very nice and all that. But then Jim actually met me on the island of Islay one day, about 1995 or 1996, and he actually took me through a tasting of some of the wonderful Ardbeg whiskies, and I was absolutely staggered at the incredible complexity that I found in there. I have to admit, and again my colleague Hamish in marketing might kick me afterwards for saying this, they were Gordon and MacPhail bottlings, because at that time it was almost impossible to find distillery bottlings. There were few and far between. And that absolutely intrigued me about Ardbeg, and I thought no more about it. And then about a year further on, it became apparent to many companies in the Scotch whisky industry that the wonderful Ardbeg distillery was up for sale. And after a fairly fierce bidding process, the former owners, Allied Domecq as they were at that time, actually looked very favourably on the bid from Glenmorangie plc, which was not the highest bid, but they felt that the Glenmorangie company would actually look after the distillery. And so the last 13 years for us have been an incredibly exciting voyage where we've tried to bring the distillery back to its former glory. Now, I'm sure a lot of you in the audience tonight very fondly remember the old Ardbeg 10-year-old. You probably remember the Allied bottling of Ardbeg 30-year-old. You maybe even remember our own lovely, delicate, delicious bottling Ardbeg 17-year-old. How many of you in the audience this evening have a bottle or two of 17-year-old stashed away? Hamish, you get any?
Container.
You know, these expressions were much loved by Ardbeg aficionados. It was a curious age at which to bottle a whisky, but when we bought the distillery in 1997, whisky from 1980 was the oldest of our young stock. I think I've got that right. So we decided to bottle some of it. There was a gap in production at the distillery for nearly 10 years. So from 1980 right through to 1989, there was no whisky production. So it's made our job very difficult in trying to maintain a degree of consistency with Ardbeg whiskies. But we truly have done our very best to satisfy Ardbeg lovers. We've tried very, very hard to keep the whisky as consistent as we could do. So tonight we're going to go through a range of our whiskies and let you guys put this to the test to see how well we've achieved that. But we became apparent to us very, very quickly that Ardbeg was much, much loved by consumers. It really is one of the very few handful of whiskies in Scotland, maybe only 5 or 6, that you could truly say have cult status. So Hamish, Michael, myself, the rest of our team take our responsibilities very, very seriously indeed. We are the current incumbents of the job to try and maintain the quality of Ardbeg, and we'd like to think that when Hamish and I drink ourselves to death, or whatever we're going to do, that we'll pass it over in good shape to our successors. But we truly have tried the best we can. We've spoken to a lot of our consumers. That's one of the key reasons why Hamish started the Ardbeg Committee, that we actually do listen to our consumers. No, honestly, we do. We truly do. And try and come out with Ardbeg expressions that we know they're going to love. So the first whisky we're going to try is our recreation of what we think of as the backbone of the Ardbeg range, and this is the mighty Ardbeg 10-year-old. Now, it will come as no surprise to you to learn that the majority of whiskies in this glass are in fact 10 years old. Some of them are a little bit older than that. We occasionally will use 11 or 12-year-old whiskies, but again, we're trying to maintain a style of whisky that obviously showcases the incredible heavy peaty character of Ardbeg, but it also showcases a little bit of the delicacy and a little bit of the complexity. Now, how many of you in the audience this evening have visited Ardbeg? For those of you who have not yet visited, why not? What's wrong with you? You'll find us very welcoming at the distillery. It truly is a spiritual place to come and visit. And when you go around, you'll see that apart from the fact that it does make the most heavily peated whisky in regular production on Islay today, there are a number of other factors in the production which give unusual characteristics to the whisky. And if you'd like to take the lid off your glass and swirl it very gently, you could be forgiven for thinking, well, you know, this is actually quite lightly peated. It is not. The malted barley is 50 to 65 parts per million in terms of the peatiness in there. It's very, very heavily peated. But I always find with certain Ardbeg whiskies that the smokiness at full strength tends to be complexed in with some of the higher alcohols, and you actually think this is quite delicate until you come to taste it. But at full strength, it really does showcase some of the complexity we get from the old-fashioned Oregon pine wooden washbacks, the fermentation vessels, very high malolactic character, so it gives this almost soapy, waxy, slightly astringent character to it. And of course the purifier on the line arm of the spirit still returns some of the distillate into the still to be redistilled, and consequently we get a dash of complexity, and I think this comes through in an unusual sort of limey, fruity character to the whisky. Now I'm sure some of you in the audience know Martine Nuet very well, and Martine describes Ardbeg 10-year-old as being a mixture of elastoplast, Band-Aid and lime juice. It's not necessarily the sexiest description I've ever heard of this whisky, but I think she's nailed it. That to me, that's the two key flavours I get, the two key aromas I get. This rather unusual pine resin or lime juice type bouquet and a little bit of something medicinal underneath it. I've seen that a few of you have already taken a little naughty sip of your whisky. If you want to do so, it's bottled at 46% alcohol by volume. It is non-chill filtered, so you get this lovely chewy texture in the mouth. Sometimes it makes me think, when I drink it at full strength, I've gone to the distillery, grabbed up a handful of peat and just started to chew and eat it. It's a meal in itself. So let's do that. Let's take a sip at full strength. Obviously, at 46%, you're going to get a degree of pepperiness on the palate, this lovely tingling sensation, but actually it's still quite gentle. You know, sometimes if you're drinking raw alcohol, you get this grippiness, this rather challenging sensation, and I don't get this at all with Ardbeg. I get this lovely mouth coating sensation. We've put a lot of effort into trying to improve the quality of wood in which Ardbeg is matured, and the very high percentage of first fill bourbon barrels is giving this nice softness in texture. Once it goes down, you get the, you know, this kind of chocolate biscuity type sensation. You get a little bit of the zesty lime, and then you get the peat starting to rise up in dense waves. So, if you all have some water in front of you, just let's add a little splash. Be very careful not to drown the whiskey. 2 parts whiskey to 1 part water, or as close as you can get it. And it really does, first of all, release that soapy, piney sensation. Marchin, you'll remember this. There was a very famous aftershave, I'm going back to the 60s here,
What are you trying to say?
called Pinot Sylvester, and it's that kind of piney type sensation. That's what I get. Maybe it was the 1950s, Martin.
Yeah,
It's very, very fragrant, very aromatic, and you really get that soapy waxiness. But when you come to sip it now, you get that bang. You really get the intense, oily, tarry peat smoke. Let's see, intense sweetness for 1 or 2 seconds, and then it's Havana cigars, it's espresso coffee, it's tarry rope, it's creosote, it's licorice, it's all these dark, rich, smoky flavours. But once that then dies down, once again you get a bit more of the delicacy, the biscuity notes, the baked bread, little bit of the liminess again, maybe even a hint of banana, something like that. But I just think it's such a wonderful, complex whiskey. And if you're going to drink everything in the glass just now, when I rabbit on for a little bit about the second whiskey, sit with the empty glass up to your nose and just get the delicious bouquet of the Ardbeg 10-year-old coming through. So this very much is the backbone of the range. It's the whiskey on which most of the rest of the range is based. Personally, I think it's the most archetypically Ardbeg in style, and it's much sought after by aficionados throughout the world. How many of you tasted Ardbeg Renaissance that we released a couple of years ago? Did you enjoy that?
That's very good.
You know, that's directionally where I'd like to take the 10-year-old, just make it a little bit more full-bodied.
I have a quick question. With the Renaissance, what was the main difference in characteristics between that and the 10-year-old?
In terms of the recipe, 80% of the whiskey came from first fill ex-bourbon barrels. So I had a lot more of that vanilla, that banana, that almond type thing, and a nice silky texture in the mouth. And it was bottled at a higher strength.
Oh,
but apart from that, you know, very similar to the 10-year-old. Okay, moving on now. We're moving clockwise round the tasting mat. Whiskey number 2 is a whiskey that divided opinion amongst Ardbeg aficionados. There were those who absolutely loved it, who really appreciated the delicacy of it, and there was 1 or 2 who sent Hamish, Michael and myself death threats because we'd taken it so far away from the traditional Ardbeg style. However, we knew that underneath all this hairy-chested smoke there was a lot of delicacy, a lot of complexity, and we wanted to try and let this shine through. So if any of you remember the 17-year-old, remember the very limited 1980 Kildalton bottling, Blasda in some respects is an homage to that style of whiskey. The whiskey came from the early noughties, as it were. Instead of the malted barley being peated to the traditional 50 to 65 ppm phenol, this was much more delicate. This was round about 15 to 20. So this is what we would call in the industry probably medium peated whiskey. We decided to bottle it at 40%. Decided to make it non-chill filter. Gasps of horror from Ardbeg aficionados. We just wanted to accentuate this delicacy, this softness. So Ardbeg Blasda was really just to try and have a bit of fun and try and express a different side of the personality of Ardbeg. Very pale in colour. Of course, Ardbeg whiskies are never going to be tainted with anything as common as caramel or something like this. The colour is always all natural.
Vanilla ice cream, isn't it?
And on the bouquet, if you didn't get the ripe bananas in the 10-year-old, I'm sure you'll be finding that now. This lovely kind of banoffee pie type sensation in the bouquet of Blasda. Very soft, very gentle. Again, you could be forgiven for thinking, has this actually come from Islay, or is this from somewhere altogether much more gentle in Scotland? It is a true Ardbeg whisky. Again, we'll find that when we taste it. So let's do this again at full strength. This is 40% alcohol by volume. Lovely hints of mint in there, spearmint or peppermint, a nice tingliness in the palate, some gentle mouth coating sensations from the vanilla. If you've ever been to Ardbeg Distillery and stood out on the end of the pier on a day when it's very stormy and the waves are crashing in and you get that lovely briny sea spray type sensation, I can get lots of that interwoven with the peppermint in this whisky. So again, this actually has quite a lot of finesse for Ardbeg. It's up to yourselves if you want to cut it, if you want to release your serpent. I always find it quite interesting to do this and bring out the different layers of flavour.
I'm glad you after that. After a few drinks, Bill. Yeah. After dinner, I might release the serpent.
Again, with water in there, you know, it's pineapple chunks, it's apricots and vanilla ice cream, lots of fruity sensations in there. But I just find this such a curious Ardbeg. You know, it's almost like 10-year-old is the father of the house and Blasda is one of the cousins out there. There's definitely a similarity. However, it's altogether different in terms of its personality. Also quite interesting if you've got people who've never tried Islay whisky before and want something a bit more gentle to introduce themselves to it. So this is Ardbeg Blasda. We were having a little bit of fun with this to try and see what else we could find. Whisky number 3 has an awful lot of very, very personal memories for Hamish and I. When we first put the proposal into the powers that be in our company, they were horrified at the thought of what we wanted to do. But uigeadail was to try and make something very different from the 17-year-old, the 10-year-old, the 1978 vintage, the 75 vintage we'd had before. So uigeadail harks back to a much more old-fashioned style of Ardbeg. Now, when we bought the distillery and managed to buy the majority of the maturing stock profile, we didn't get it all, but we got most of it. A lot of the very, very old Ardbegs were matured in Spanish oak sherry casks, some in butts, some in puncheons, and some in dinky little Spanish oak hogsheads. The whisky from these barrels was very, very intriguing in nature, and I'm sure most of you have tried Islay whiskies which have been matured exclusively in sherry casks. It makes for a very, very pungent, very heavy, very heady combination. I remember again back to my days when I worked for the Distillers Company, buying the very first Kalila Manager's Dram, which was matured exclusively in a sherry cask, and the whole thing was so rich and so heavy that after drinking it I fell asleep. Mind you, that's maybe because I drank 3/4 of the bottle at one sitting. But peat and sherry make a very, very pungent, very powerful combination. So for uigeadail, what we decided to do was to take some whiskies which were more along the lines of the 10-year-old in style, you know, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old whiskies, and try and combine that with some of our very old, rich, sherry-matured stock from the 1970s. Because we were using a range of different whiskies, rather than call it after the casks in which it was matured or the age, we decided to call it, name it after the deep dark, mysterious loch up in the hillside. Sorry, a bit of marketing bullshit there for you. I'm not first tonight, won't be the last either. The water for Ardbeg is drawn from Loch Uigeadail up in the hillside. Deep, dark, mysterious, very rich, peat-laden water. So we've named it after that. So for what this is worth, this is my favourite Ardbeg in the current range. So Uigeadail has a very healthy dash of whiskies matured in Spanish oak sherry cask. It's bottled at 54.2% alcohol by volume. I would not recommend necking this back in a 1 hour. I would recommend taking your time and sipping and savouring it. Lovely rich dark colour from the Spanish oak, of course. And on the nose, this is altogether different. This is the big bad cousin of 10-year-old or Blasta. It's very rich, it's very oily, it's very spicy, it's quite tarry. I can get hints of flowering currants. I can get hickory smoked barbecue spare ribs. I can get,
It's incredible.
you know, a hint of the sherry and the other raisins that date to the sultanas.
Yeah.
I'm going to add a splash of water. I'm going to get my serpent out before I taste.
You need to be steady where you say that, I think, really.
Just wait until the end.
I know people who look for batch numbers on this. They look for specific batches. It's
Very
it's
interesting
crazy.
question here. A lot of our Ardbeg aficionados ask us to put batch numbers on the bottle. The reason we don't do that, apart from the fact that we'd have to re-originate the labels, is that as far as Michael and Hamish and I are concerned, we try very hard to ensure that every batch of Uigeadail or 10-year-old is the same. I know we're dealing with a natural product and there are small differences there, but that's our job at the end of the day, to try and introduce a degree of consistency. So, you know, if you really want that to happen, I'm the wrong person to lobby.
No.
It's him. It's his fault. You know, we try and accommodate people like that in terms of some of our limited bottlings we do. But, you know, we are aware that people would like to find this. Okay, how many of the rest of you have released your serpents? Let me see. I'm getting this rather interesting, diesely, tarry, creosote type note on the nose now. It's really bringing the guts of this whiskey out. I got told an absolutely terrible joke, I must tell you. One of our operations managers, I was talking about the creosote note in Ardbeg whiskies, and it was at the time of the Grand National. And he said, Bill, if you want to put money in a horse in the Grand National, there was a horse called Creosote running. And I said, well, why should I back that, Callum? And he said, it's good in the fences. And being thick like I am, it took me 10 minutes when I was back at my desk before I finally got it. Sorry. So, with that creosote, tarry, good on the fences type of nose, let's take a sip now.
It's really good, yeah. It's huge.
This is a very big, very rich, very intense whiskey. It's again got a sensation in the mouth that gives a combination of pepperiness and a kind of chewy coating sensation. It's non-chill filtered. All of these lovely essential oils from the barley are still in there in the whiskey, so you get this lovely chewy, silky texture to it. Sultanas, dates, flowering currants, barbecue spared ribs, lots of tarry rope. And it's got this overall sensation, you know, if you're sitting down on Christmas Day and tucking into your Christmas pudding, you've covered it in whiskey or brandy, set it on fire, and you've taken a mouthful while it's still burning. That's the sensation I think you find when you drink Ardbeg Uigeadail. So it's this very, very big, rich, fiery, spicy, incredibly full flavoured sensation. Now, it reminds me of, it was the Uigeadail launch with Michael Jackson.
That's right.
The late Michael Jackson as I'm sure most of you know, was a very, very big fan of smoky Islay whiskies. And we took Michael to quite a few of our launch events, and when we launched uigeadail, Michael really wanted something very intense, and it was a memory that I will never forget, that Michael had been drinking all day, and when I came to speak to him after the tasting, his eyes were doing this incredible, bizarre figure of 8 type thing, and all he could say to me was, "Bill, I like your whiskey, but it's not mucky enough. I want something really mucky." So I have to say, I think uigeadail is the second muckiest Ardbeg in the range. And if we move back to the bottom left, let's move swiftly on to what I think now is the muckiest, which is corryvreckan. Unfortunately, Michael didn't get to taste corryvreckan, but I'm sure if he did, he would greatly appreciate it. So, corryvreckan, this amazing whirlpool, which is sort of off the coast of Islay or Jura or somewhere in that vicinity, Hamish.
It's off Jura.
Sorry, where? Jura? Where's that? Actually, Jura. Now, there's a story. When we came to be looking for a new distillery manager about 3 years ago, believe it or not, such a peach of a job is not everyone's cup of tea, and to be actually marooned on the island of Islay doesn't appeal to everyone. So we had a few candidates applied for it, and one stood head and shoulders above everyone else, and that of course is the bold Michael. And I think what Michael likes so much about it is that for Michael, who moved from Jura to Islay, that's like Hamish or I moving from Edinburgh to Manhattan. Really vibrant, really lively. I'm sure a number of you in the audience know our very good friend Richard Patterson from the White Mackay Company, who Michael used to work for. After Michael handed in his notice from the job as manager of Isle of Jura, I hadn't actually spoken to Richard for about 6 weeks. So I phoned him up from my desk one day, and the phone answered, and Richard rather hotly said, "Richard Patterson," as he does. And I said, "Richard, it's Bill here." And there was silence for about 5 or 6 seconds, and then he said, "You bastard!" So I knew what he was referring to, that he felt that I stole Michael from Isle of Jura, but you came willingly, didn't you? Good answer. So corryvreckan is sort of in the sea off the coast of Islay, Jura-ish. It's the world's third or second largest whirlpool. And the reason why we named it after such a wonderful natural phenomenon is that we think when you drink it, like the whirlpool itself, it sucks you right down into its peaty, murky depths.
Could you just do that again? Sorry, I missed
It starts with an S, you know that much.
Bill, do they measure the whirlpools end to end or top to bottom?
I think it's radius.
Yeah. I'm sure it can't be top to bottom, but it covers quite a vast area.
Where is
I'm
the
sorry about that.
And where is the largest? This is the second.
It's Niagara. Niagara.
Just off Sky.
Third largest is? Right. Again, Ardbeg corryvreckan is what I would describe as a very, very hairy-chested whiskey. A whopping 57.2% alcohol by volume. And corryvreckan grew out of a series of experiments we've carried out. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with our Glenmorangie brand, which frankly is march and behave. It's actually quite easy to innovate and experiment with Glenmorangie because it's such a delicate whiskey, it lends itself to being matured in different types of casks. But with Ardbeg, with the incredible robust peat, it's much more difficult to try and do something different. So, way back in 1998 and 1999, myself and my right arm, as I call her, Rachel Barry, who I'm sure a lot of you know, carried out a series of experiments where we took Ardbeg's raw spirit, the new make spirit, and put it into a range of different oak types to see what the end result would be. Our favourite from the 6 or 7 that we tried was new virgin French oak, and the whisky from these barrels became the heart of the recipe for the first vatings of corryvreckan. So going forward, corryvreckan again is, to coin an LVMH term, it's an assemblage of different types of whiskies, very skillfully and carefully vatted together. The heart of corryvreckan is this, whisky from French oak cask. Glenmorangie and French oak cask I have tried. The French oak really dominates, but with Ardbeg it came up with quite an interesting, spicy, chewy, toasty combination. So that's how we make corryvreckan. Again, a lot of the whiskies we use for corryvreckan are also common to the recipe for 10-year-old and for uigeadail, but the key heart of the recipe is new Ardbeg spirit, which has been wholly matured in French oak barrels. You can see that in the colour. It's taken an awful lot of this lovely mahogany colour. Patience, sorry, were you going to ask me a question there?
No.
And on the nose, it's got this lovely, deep, toasty pungency to it. Imagine yourself in this little boat sailing across corryvreckan. You're starting to get quite worried now as it starts to suck you down into it, and let the whisky suck you down. Now you have to be very careful when you say that. Suck you down.
Serpents and suck you down? Where are we going with this?
You haven't got your serpent out on this one.
Yes, as well. So, it's got that unusual note which I often associate with French oak. It's almost like cedar wood or, cigar humidor type of sensation. There's a delightful, intense, zesty sharpness to it. I get a hint of the Ardbeg lime in there, but I'm definitely going to get my serpent out now, having been invited to do so.
Just don't suck it down.
And wow, this really has brought the incredible deep depth, the guts of this whisky out. This is very, very tarry, very oily, very creosote. If any of you have gone to Japan on business or holiday and have tried the crispy seaweed there, that's the sensation I'm getting in the nose now. This lovely tarry, oily, seaweedy. I'm getting more of that slightly perfumed cedarwood type note. And I don't know how many of you are chefs in the audience, but if you enjoy cooking a nice ribeye or sirloin steak and coating it with a bit of pepper, a bit of salt, I'm getting something that reminds me, maybe it's because I burn my steaks when I do, I'm not a very good cook, I'm getting something that reminds me of the smell from that. So, let's taste it, let's hold it, roll it about in the palate for 5 or 10 seconds before swallowing.
It's got a huge chipotle flavour as well. So.
It's one of my favourites.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
It's just like the dense waves are brushing over you. You almost feel yourself being anaesthetised with the sensation here. Now, I think this was Rachel's comment in the tasting notes. She said it was like steak smothered in oysters and Tabasco sauce. There's a real intense pepperiness, a chewiness, a spiciness, lots of nice structured oak tannins in there. Actually, quite a degree of dryness on the palate compared to the other ones. Again, I think that is primarily due to the tannins from the French oak, but it's a huge, chewy, spicy combination. I did a tasting at Whisky Live in Gay Paris in Paris, not last year but the year before, in which I paired it with a cigar, and there was a beautiful limited edition Oopman cigar which went fantastically with this very intense, very chocolatey, very spicy cigar. So if you like smoking cigars with your whisky, I'd say uigeadail and corryvreckan are really nice whiskies to pair with it. So, did we have any corryvreckan virgins in the audience tonight? Alice, how did you find that? Did we break you in gently? Very sexy, wow.
I found it on the nose, a bit like smelling someone that wants to go into hospital.
Right.
Tasting it with like...
So not Hamish smelling corryvreckan. So is that because, is there a muskiness or something in there?
Move on, Bill.
Send it to Kenzo. See how they do.
I've been advised to move on, so I can tell you what. Right.
Perhaps Al should get a bottle of this and apply it liberally.
Now, 46, 40, 54.2, a rather lily-livered 57.2. We're now moving on to the latest release of Supernova, weighing in at a whopping 60.1%. So, after this whisky, you will truly believe anything that Hamish, Michael or myself say to you. This is a very, very big whisky. Supernova was our idea to try and release, in some respects, the ultimate Ardbeg. The first release was the most oily, peaty, smoky Ardbeg we had ever made. However, the one proviso was that we didn't want it just to taste of peat smoke. We wanted there to be some of the traditional Ardbeg balance, some of the traditional Ardbeg complexity in there. So again, at full strength, you could be forgiven for thinking that, you know, okay, Bill, you're bumming this up quite a bit. It's not actually that big. Just wait. On the nose, it's quite a closed whisky. A lot of whiskies at that very, very high strength are quite closed. You need to caress them gently in the palm of your sweaty hand. You need to talk to them. You need to coax them out of the glass. Perhaps you need to add just a splash of water to them. But at full strength,
That was a good Richard
it's
Patterson.
unbelievably pungent. It's very, very aromatic. I can get a little bit of the poached pear type flavour in there. It's very much in the background, but I can get lots and lots of cinnamon or clove or something like that.
You see, I think for a heavily peated whiskey, this has still got a real... It's very delicate.
Yeah.
It's not overpoweringly peaty. You're not sort of going into a war of the hottest curry, if you like. Really, that's, you know, there's something about this which has still got a
It's
delicacy.
definitely not Vindaloo style,
No.
and I think that's just so much the house style of Ardbeg that it has other flavours in there. Now I've released my Serpent, I've added a bit of water, and I'm getting this lovely, almost lavender, Parma violet type smell.
I have to say, this is almost to me like a mature Blasda.
Yeah.
I don't know if if it came from the same line of thought, but it kind of
Well, it's totally different, isn't it?
Although it's a big contrast, obviously, because ppm's different, but
In terms
Yeah.
of the age of distillation, you may just have hit the nail on the head there. They are very similar in years, round about the early noughties.
right.
But it's got this, oh dear, that wasn't Daggers Hamish, was it? But it's got this incredible Parma violet. And you know, for those of you who enjoy Islay whiskies, like your Kalilas, like your Beaumores, like your Ardbegs, you get this lovely perfumed fragrance to them.
Yeah.
So, having explored the bouquet of the whisky, maybe even, I don't know if you were doing this, Marcin, a little splash on your hand there, rubbing it together, trying to see what you find there.
Is this part of your chatterblind? You know, for later on.
Let's take again a sip and hold it in the palate for a few seconds before swallowing, and consider the explosion of sensation and flavour we're going to get here.
Sorry, but what was this bottled at again?
60.1. So a little bit more than the first bottling of Supernova. And my
It
goodness,
comes through there a lot.
I feel like Puff the Magic Dragon now. I feel like I'm breathing fire. So I get this smoke and salt, I get chili and chocolate, I get licorice, I get hickory, I get a hint of pine resin in there. Again, I get that lovely Band-Aid elastoplast type thing. And this full intensity actually dies away very quickly and you get some of the gentle notes in there. Have any of you actually cut a peat moss on Isla?
Yep.
Yes.
You know when you do that, you get this kind of damp, heathery, mossy type of smell. I can find elements of that in the taste of Ardbeg Supernova. So, this is our limited occasional release. Every time we find a parcel of stock that is very, very heavily peated, very intense, if Michael finds that in the distillery, then we'll get together and we'll maybe release the odd bottling of Supernova. So it is the most intense, the most heavily peated Ardbeg. It's more than 100 parts per million phenol in here. However, as with all Ardbegs, we would like to believe that there is some delicate, some fragrance in there. So, what do you think, folks? Supernova 2010?
Super.
Good. Excellent.
It's so different from the original.
Did you have you tasted the first bottling of Supernova? Did you find it different from that?
Not very different. It brings out a lot more fruitiness.
You know, we didn't try and make it deliberately different, but you know, we always like to think with these limited bottlings there's something. So, Supernova 2010, the most heavily peated Ardbeg we've ever released. Okay, Rollercoaster.
Sorry, Bill, the Supernova,
Yeah.
what was the ABV?
60.1. It was more than 100 parts per million. We had to do it, Marcin, by back calculation, by actually measuring the level of phenols in the final whiskey and then back calculating it.
Bill, I have a quick question. Oh, go on, sorry, that's fine.
Will, have you, with the, you're sort of boasting about this one being the most heavily peated, have you ever sort of tried it and gone sort of too far and said, no, that's too peated?
Actually, yes, we have, and we've lost that degree of finesse and the degree of balance, so we've taken a view not to bottle that whiskey, because, you know, it's powerful enough, and people love Ardbeg because as well as being very hairy-chested, it's also actually slightly elegant. It has this complexity to it. So the most ultra extreme Ardbegs, we're not bottling them at this stage.
That's what I meant before about the whole curry thing.
Yeah.
You can almost enter, you know, who's going to have the Tindaloo, who's going to have the File. You know,
Yeah.
it becomes a competition who has the heaviest peated whiskey.
Well, it's
and
like,
you're just tasting peat. There's no finesse at all.
Exactly. You get to a stage where it's actually, metaphorically speaking, painful to drink, and we don't want that to be the case. We still want people to recognise it as an Ardbeg. So, Ollie, yes, the answer to your question is yes, we've done some ultra stuff, but no, it's not the Ardbeg style.
but you've got a pet bunny.
But possibly the ultra stuff will over the years mellow.
Who knows, Ian?
Bill, what's
How
the
long has
oldest?
it had so far?
That's it.
I'm going to ask you about this later. What's the oldest stocks you've got left in the warehouse now?
Ah, right. That's a question which, to be honest, it's quite confidential. We still have stocks from the 1970s.
Really interesting. Single night. Okay. Good.
You know, watch this space. We've truly done our very best to try and eke it out so people get access to it.
With the Nambiche, the 1990 vintages, is there any sort of continuation with some of those whiskies? Because I mean, that for me was one of the best expressions you've ever done.
Arinambestia was my favourite after the 17-year-old in the range. And yes, we're going to bring other things out with that style in it.
Right.
But you know, again, as we keep saying, we did our very, very best. When we first reopened the distillery in 97, 98, 99, it was very limited production. It took a few years before we built it back up to its maximum production. So, you know, I hope and I pray that Hamish and I, A, are not sacked by the company. We're still here in 10 years' time, and we're also still alive. But, you know, in that time, then I'd like to think that the stocks of Ardbeg will be much more widely available. But at the moment, you know, for people who love Ardbeg 10-year-old and uigeadail, you know, fill your boots. There's lots of it out there. But we're trying to build up a stock profile.
With the charity bottlings like the Lord Robinson that you've just done, will there be more of those things coming through as well? Because obviously it's quite an interesting marketing thing in its own right.
I'm not sure there'll necessarily be more charity bottlings. There's always, I mean, we're always experimenting. There's going to be a lot more Ardbegs from where these ones came from. But 10-year-old will always be the backbone of the range. 10-year-old corryvreckan and uigeadail are going to be the core range.
That's the troika that's going to form Ardbeg
Okay.
in the next few years.
Cool.
We'll always innovate, because that's what we do. Can't resist it. But we'll always, we just want to stabilise the range and have a consistency. Because we went through, if you remember, the very young, still young, what was that? And we did a lot of fun things in the, you know, the period when we were building up our stocks. And we don't want to have a reputation of just proliferation. Yeah. Just for the sake of it. Every whiskey we produce, I think, Bill, fair to say, there is a reason for doing it.
Yeah.
And you know, there's got to be a good rationale for doing it. So
we want to maintain a degree of integrity in relation to the quality of our products,
which
so
is
don't
important.
Want to do too many, but you know, watch this space.
Okay.
But it is fair to say that if you're part of the committee, right, the Ardbeg committee, they're our fan club, and they expect every year a bottling which will be
something interesting,
exclusive to them and be exceptional. Yeah. And that's what Bill and I always, and Mickey, we're always thinking about.
And then how? This is just a off-the-cuff thought. If you've got someone like Lefroy doing the Cardez for the Fezile, will that potentially relate Ardbeg to the Fezile and something just for the committee, or will it always be just something?
We'll not bother about what other distilleries are doing. We'll always do our own thing. You know, a lot of the other companies have done some great things, and we take our hat off to them. But we're never going to be influenced by other brands and what they do.
Cool.
But I mean, for instance, you know, as I think Neil was saying earlier, you know, making that pilgrimage to Ireland for the Whisky Festival, we need to have a bottling which is specific to that.
Yeah.
It's a reward, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It's a reward for getting there. But also at the same time, you should remember. At the same time, you should remember we are doing things specifically for the committee, which nobody else does.
Yeah.
So you know, we feel we're delivering.
But we are always open to suggestions. So, I guess the whole idea of these 2 or 3 days worth of celebrations, which Michael, Hamish and I are certainly having down in London. That's what our chief executive thinks. We're just down in London to have fun for 3 days. And you know what? He's right. It all centres around the 10th anniversary of the Ardbeg committee. So, when we decided to try and do something to celebrate it, we batted back and forth a few ideas. 10-year-old cask strength bottling? Boring. Been there, done that. You know, 10 casks all vatted together? Too small. And after much gnashing of teeth, much deliberating, many, many nights in great bars and top restaurants in Edinburgh, well, maybe not, in our dreams, we came up with the idea that because it was 10 years, we decided that we should put together an assemblage whiskies from each of the first 10 years of our production. So 1997, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We thought about this in 2009, so 2006 whiskey was just legal. It was 3 years old, it could be called Scotch whiskey. Being the 97 stock, and then sliding right down to the tip, which was the youngest, the 2006 stock.
How do you spell the sausages?
We should have called it that, actually. So, that idea was then passed over to the wonderful Rachel Barry. But Rachel, being who she is, she wasn't about to listen to arseholes like Hamish or I. So she took that idea and she put together 4 experimental vatings, including our one, and then gave the resulting whiskies back to Hamish and I to taste blind. And we unanimously tasted a whisky which was one of Rachel's own recipes. And when we looked at the diagram of the quantities of the different years, it was a bit more like that. Hence the name Rollercoaster. So that's where that came from. It was nothing to do with the unbelievable marketing genius of Hamish here. It was because the stock profile looked like that. So, Rollercoaster, 57.3% alcohol by volume. 15,000 bottles of this were produced. Michael, any left?
I've got one.
Have you got any in your big coat pocket?
I have a couple in a very well stocked cupboard.
Right. Most of it is now gone, but this was our way of trying to celebrate the Ardbeg committee and to try and introduce something a little bit different. Now the colour, again, completely natural, is a lovely medium gold. The bouquet, again, has that very, very fresh sea spray, pepperminty type sensation. It is pungent, of course it is, 57.1. So, for perhaps the final time this evening, I will release my serpent, cut it with a little bit of water. And now I'm getting this incredible carbolic soap, this Wright's coal tar soap type sensation. Some nice tropical fruits in there, a hint of pineapple, a little bit of apricot. There's a lot of first fill casks in here. It's primarily from first fill X bourbon casks. Keep swirling, keep sniffing. What else do you find? Any suggestions from the audience in terms of the bouquet?
Tomato ketchup with chipotle sauce.
Tomato ketchup. Now that didn't quite make the tasting notes.
But it's tomato ketchup with chipotle.
I actually used to find that in a lot of the whiskies when I worked for the distillers company, this tomato type sensation.
Like the fresh vine, just with a hit of chipotle.
Broccoli covered in marmite.
Broccoli and marmite, that famous dish.
I'm not coming for dinner at your house.
Lemon meringue. So I get a good amount.
Ian controversially said some lemon meringue. Really? Call yourself a journalist?
I get a bit of strong the side of the swan.
I think it's got a bit more lime than lemon for me personally.
Okay, whatever we find, let's try a sip. Let's chew on it. Let's savour it. Let's swallow it.
Yeah.
It's a very structured whiskey. It's got that very intense black currant, almost Ribena type sensation. How many of you own a pet cat? You maybe know what I'm talking about here.
The litter basket.
That sort of thing.
I must admit.
Very fragrant, very aromatic. Lots of chewy oak tannins in there. A nice bit of banana. It's a bit more like green banana.
I'm just thinking, you made me very nervous there, actually, about tasting my cap.
Only when the wife's
if
away.
I've made you nervous, you ain't seen nothing yet. Just wait.
He occasionally wears a bow tie for those sort of evenings, but
He rarely releases his serpent though.
Lots of chocolate, lots of cherry, a hint maybe of marzipan in there. Again, you know, I think most people tasting this blind would say, I think we've got an Ardbeg here, but it's quite different, you know. To me, it's almost combining the intensity of corryvreckan with the youthfulness of Blasta. So, this is our thank you to the Ardbeg committee, our celebration for 10 years of the committee, Ardbeg Rollercoaster. I'm very gratified to see, I can see quite a few empty glasses in the tasting mats. Well done. I'm not sure how many of you are planning on going out and having a cigar afterwards. Oh, we are, Hamish, certainly. Sorry, a terrible story, which apologies to my colleagues who've heard this many times before. One of my favourite stories, and it's a kind of vaguely associated to cigars and whiskey. If I'm smoking a cigar, I would tend not necessarily to pair Glenmorangie with it. I would typically have an Ardbeg. And it goes back to just before the general election, when a gentleman was going round the doors of the houses polling on behalf of the Labour Party. And he went to the first house with his big red rosette on. This was in Scotland, so you know he was much loved by the population there. Went to the first door. Gentleman opened the door, saw the rosette, and he immediately broke into a broad smile. So the pollster knew instantly he didn't actually need to canvass on behalf of Gordon Brown, our dear, much missed, departed Prime Minister. The gentleman said, look, I've always voted Labour, my father's always voted Labour, my grandfather always voted for the Labour Party, so I'm going to vote. So he thanked him and moved on his merry way. He went to house number 2. This wasn't a knocker, this was a doorbell this time, slightly more upmarket house. The door was opened, and this time he was greeted by the lady of the house. And as soon as she saw the red rosette, instantly her body language changed. There was folded arms, there was the head cocked, not coquettishly to one side, rather angrily to one side. Her foot was tapping, and he said, look, I'm representing the Labour Party, and she said, please go, I've got nothing to say to you. So he realised very quickly that she was a supporter of David Cameron. He thanked her anyway, went away and into house number 3. Knocked on the door of house number 3, wondering what was going to greet him this time, and after about 5 minutes, and he could hear music thumping in the background, the door was burst open, and to his amazement, he was greeted by a 14-year-old boy who had a glass of whiskey in one hand and a cigar in the other. And he said, are your parents in, son? And the boy looked at the whiskey and looked at his cigar and said, what the fuck do you think? Nothing to do with whiskey, nothing really to do with Ardbeg. I thought I would tell it anyway. So, I do trust you've enjoyed tasting what has really been the evolution of the Ardbeg range through all the different expressions. Yeah. If you have any questions for any of us, you know, we're not going away just yet unless you chase us out. Hamish, Michael, Leanne, Claire will all be about. If you've got any questions about the Ardbeg range, we'll be delighted to try and answer them, unless they're very controversial ones like Mr. Wisniewski tried to ask. Any final questions before we move through for dinner?
Yeah, what question did Ian ask?
Top secret. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being so attentive, and let's look forward to enjoying the rest of the evening.